How do you turn some requirements into a software design? In test-driven development, it's well known we drive development using tests. But how do you get from requirements to test cases? In this session, we'll look at the role of examples and designing by usage first. Hi, I'm Emily Bache. I'm a software developer and creator of Saman Coaching. This is a guided learning hour, and it's designed to help developers and technical coaches to get going with team training sessions. Based on this video, you can lead the session on my behalf. I will also provide you with some supporting materials. There is a coding exercise and an activity board. The code is on my GitHub, and you can get a copy of this online whiteboard via my Patreon. So do check that out. And of course, if you like this content, please subscribe to my channel and like this video. If you haven't seen one of these guided learning hours before, do take a look at my other video, Guided Learning Hour How To. But also watch to the end of this video where I've got a session briefing which explains more about how to run the session. I'm about to begin the part of this video that you can show your team, and it's marked with the chapter Gather Your Team, so you can start from there when you're ready. Hi, I'm Emily Bache. Welcome to this guided learning hour. Today we're talking about requirements, examples, and test cases. And we're going to be using this shared online whiteboard everyone should have access to. First, I've got a little puzzle for you. I've got a pile of notes here, and some of them describe specifications or requirements, and some of them describe examples. And I'd like you just to sort them either side of the line. Do that all together. The person who's hosting the session can move the notes, and everyone else can vote by pointing which side of the line does this one go, and hopefully you'll be able to make a decision. If you can't work it out or the votes are split evenly, just leave it on the line. This is what I came up with when I sorted these notes, and you might not agree completely because sometimes it's a little bit ambiguous whether something is a spec or whether it's an example. But I think it's useful to understand a problem to have both these things, both the description of the general rules and an example that illustrates them. Because usually when we're developing code, we start with some kind of spec, and examples actually help us to understand that spec. And also, examples are great for turning into test cases. In test-driven development, we derive the design of the code from those test cases. So today's session, we're going to look more closely at this step where you turn examples into test cases and into a design. This is a description of the shopping basket discount code kata. So we have some items in a shopping basket that have a unit price and a quantity, and we need to write some code that will allow you to find out the quantity of a particular item from the basket and calculate the total price. So that's usually calculated by the sum of the unit price times the quantity for all the items. But there are some additional rules here, because if you buy in bulk, you get a discount. If the total value of the basket is more than $100, you get 5%. And if it's more than $200, you get 10%. As well as the spec, you also get an example. And here it's illustrated, well, what happens if you put an apple, 5 apples, with each costing $10, and a banana and some citrus fruit. And this basket qualifies for a 5% discount because it costs over $100. This is very expensive fruit. But it means that the total price is actually $151.94. And this example helps to illustrate these rules. So I went away and took this example and turned it into a test case. So here I did some design of some code, and I would like you to take a closer look at this design that I've come up with. In small groups, I want you to evaluate this design. I've got a frame like this for each small group, and again, there's a pile of notes with things that you need to sort to one side or the other. So these are design characteristics that I think this code may or may not have. And you need to decide, can I make a decision? Does this code have this design characteristic? Does it not have it? Or shall I leave it on the line? I can't really tell from this code. So split up into small groups and spend a few minutes evaluating my design here. Well, maybe I'm biased because I designed this code, but I think you can tell some things about this design, and this is how I would arrange those notes with all of those design characteristics. You may not agree with me, but I'm hoping you'll have found that you actually could evaluate this design based purely on looking at the way this test case is written. I have not given you the implementation of any of these classes. And I think that is the interesting point, that you can evaluate this design just from that. What we're talking about here is something I would call usage-first design, where you design new classes and methods by how they will be used. And other people have different names for this. I've heard it also called consume-first programming or example-guided design. The basic idea is that you try and use the thing before you implement it. So here I've used it in a test case, but you actually can do usage-first design in the production code. Just when you feel you need a new class, you find the place you're going to use it and write the code that uses it before you design it. It means that you focus on the interface to your new code rather than the implementation. And if you don't like what you see, you can change that design quickly and easily while it's the cheapest possible to do so before the implementation exists. This is something we do in test-driven development because we write the tests first and use the design that we make in the tests to influence how we then implement that design. The thing is, with TDD, you don't start with that kind of big example that we just reviewed. You start with a simple example, and then you build up the functionality gradually, example by example, sliver of implementation by sliver of implementation. So for this problem, the first test is probably for an empty shopping basket. That's the simplest example I can think of, when the quantity of any item you asked it for should be 0. In a minute, you're all going to do this kata, small example by small example, but first I'm just going to show you how I would do this with a short demo. In this demo, I'm tackling the shopping basket kata in C#. You may be using a different programming language or environment, but test-driven development should look pretty much the same in any language. So try to focus on the way I turn examples into test cases and how that drives my design. This is the code for the test case that we looked at earlier. And this code, I made it compile, but this test doesn't pass, so I've marked it with this ignore marker. But the implementation for shopping basket is here. You can see that it's got the right methods, so it compiles, but they don't do anything. They throw an exception. Similarly, I've got a basket item class that again throws an exception. It doesn't actually do anything. But this was enough to kind of evaluate the design. And this test case, it just says that the results were ignored. Okay. The other thing I've got here is a list of examples. So I've done a little bit of kind of, analysis of this problem and decided that this is a good way to break it down into examples. And that's the part of TDD that we'll probably practice at a future session. But in this guided learning hour, you can use my list of examples to turn into test cases, because that's what we want to practice, turning examples into test cases. So the first test case will be for this example when the basket is empty and there are no items. So I'm going to name this test case empty basket contains nothing. Yes. And then I should write some code here. It's going to be kind of similar to what I wrote in this big test case. I'm going to need to construct a basket and then ask it how much of a particular item it contains. And it should contain 0 of that item. And this test case, now when I run it, fails, which is great. That's the first step of TDD, having a red test, and it fails because of this exception in the getQuantity method. Now, the simplest thing I can think of to make this work is just to have it instead return 0. And that, I think, is enough to get this test to pass. Taking small steps, building up my design gradually. Great, so I think I'm ready for the next example. I can get rid of that comment, I don't need it, I've turned it into a test case, cross that item off my list and take the next one. So the next example I'm going to turn into a test case is for one item, and I'm going to name this test case one item. And it's going to be kind of similar to the last one I wrote, except that I'm actually going to put something into my shopping basket. So we're going to have one item. It's going to be an A item, apples. And yeah, so I should check that that matches up. And then, of course, I need to put it in the item in the basket. And just one of it to begin with. Okay, so when I run this test, I'm expecting it to fail. Ah, great, it fails because of an exception. So the stack trace points me straight to where I need to fix. I need to fix the basket item constructor. So let's add a property for each of these parameters that the constructor gets. And that can be basically a read-only property. And that might be enough to make my test pass. No, of course it's not. I need to do some more. So here in the add method, I need to implement this so that I can put this item in my basket. So I need some kind of container class to put it in. And so let's just pretend I've got one and add it, and then decide what kind of container class I want here. Some kind of property. The simplest container class is a list, so let's begin with that. I might decide later I need a different container class, but for the moment, this is an implementation detail. And that might be enough to get my test to pass, maybe? Oh, it's warning me here. I need to actually initialize this as well, so that I actually have an instance of my list to put things in. Okay, and the test still fails. It doesn't crash anymore though, which is progress. And it's that return 0. It needs to instead perhaps just count how many items I've got in my list. And that makes my next test case pass. Great, so I can remove that redundant comment, cross the item off my test list, and start working on the next example. So this one's very similar, except that I'm going to have 2 items. And it's probably a good idea to begin with just copying the previous test case because it's going to be quite similar. And this one is going to be called 2 items. I can review these names later on as I get more test cases, but for the moment that's enough to distinguish this scenario. And this test case also fails. Okay, so the next thing is clear. I need to go and implement this so that this test passes. But I'm not going to do the rest of the demo now. I think hopefully you've got the idea. This is what I want you to do now in an exercise. Use this test list to implement the tests one at a time and build just enough implementation to make that test pass, and then go to the next one. Now it's your turn to write some code. And as I said before, I don't want you to start with that test for the 5% discount and all those apples and bananas and so on. I want you to start with a much simpler test case, an empty basket. And in fact, I've written the list of test cases here and in the code that you'll start from. And I want you to do them one at a time, translating the example into a test case and then implementing it to make it pass. And when you get to the end of this list, hopefully everything should be working and the original test for the 5% discount should actually pass when you enable it. So that's something to aim for. You can work on this in pairs or you can do it all together if you prefer. I hope you've had a good time writing some code with test-driven development today. In this last section, I would like you to spend some time just reflecting on what's happened and what you might have learned, and write a note. In your own words, can you explain, are there any advantages to using examples to guide design? I hope this session gave you and your team some new insights into test-driven development and how it changes the way you develop a new design. So next time you're designing some new code, see if you can come up with some examples to help you. You could also try to work from the place the new code is used before you write the implementation. Usage first. Happy coding! This is the session briefing. It's intended for the developer or coach who's going to host the guided learning hour. And my hope is, with a little help from me, leading these sessions is something that most developers can do alongside a normal job. In this particular guided learning hour, there are 4 points where I ask you to pause the video and lead activities with your team. There is a connect, a concept code review, a concrete practice, and a conclusions. And it shows on the screen now roughly how long each activity should take, because part of your job is to keep track and prompt people when it's time for the next part. The first thing you need to facilitate is the connect, and this is the part where I need you to have your finger on the mouse moving the notes to one side or the other. So you need to establish how people are going to indicate their vote, which side of the line it should go on, whether they're just going to point where you can see them in their cameras or if you're in person, or whether there's some other signal that they need to give, or they could just, shout, or I don't know. You'll work something out. And then when they voted, just move to the other side and then just read out the next note. I don't think it's a very good idea to have a big discussion at this point. Just go with the majority vote and then move to the next one. This is really just to get people thinking and warmed up and remembering that they do know this. They've seen examples and specs before. The next exercise is where you're evaluating the design that I've done in this test case. And I think it's probably better to do this in small groups so that people have more time to talk and read the code. So you will need to prepare a board for them, each group to look at. If you've got a copy of my board, you can just duplicate this frame for as many groups as you've got. And if it's not my board that you're using, you might need to translate the code and create your own notes, and I'm sure you can manage that. While they're doing the exercise, you probably shouldn't need to interfere very much. And if you zoom out, you can see the notes moving and get an impression of how far people have got with the exercise and whether you can finish early or whether you should just wait for the time to be up. You've got 10 minutes for this part and just stop them at the end of that time or when you think they're finished. And actually, at this point, you might not want to put the video on straight away. You could reveal the frame that's got my sample solution and then perhaps just discuss that a little bit, whether that's the same as what everyone's got or whether they had different opinions. I mean, this doesn't need to turn into a very long discussion, but I think it could be interesting for you to see whether you thought the same as me. But as I say in the video, it doesn't really matter if you agree with me or not. The point is that you could evaluate the design just from the test case. The main coding exercise, I think, is probably best to do in pairs so that people get a bit more time at the keyboard and a bit more actual hands-on practice. I've given you the test list of examples that you're going to turn into test cases as you build up the design incrementally. And that is designed to make it easier. One of the skills of TDD is, of course, to take a spec and generate that list of examples that is kind of enabling you to build it incrementally. But that's not the skill we're practicing today. So I've given you that list so that you can just focus on this skill of turning examples into test cases and building things incrementally. Now, you might find that people are very good at TDD already and finish this very quickly, and they need more to do. And this is an opportunity to point out to them that I've given them not only the examples, but also a target design that they're heading for. Now, they could take the same example list and aim for a different design. So you could get them to start over and think of a different way to implement a shopping basket. And hopefully they would find that an interesting challenge. In the conclusions part, I ask people to write down their thoughts about what is the main idea with usage first or consumer first development. But that's not the only aspect of TDD that we've practiced today. So I think it's very useful to get people to try and write down their thoughts on that. But we have also, as well as usage first, we've been practicing incremental development, where you build up a design piece by piece. And I think we're going to need more practice on both of these things. So there's going to be more learning hours on this. And I also just wanted to note there's a lot more to TDD that we haven't practiced. I mean, it's not only incremental, it's also iterative, where you revisit your list of your design. So there's a lot more to TDD and there will be more sessions. But for today, it's enough in the conclusions if people are trying to remember what they've learned about usage first design. Okay, that was the briefing. So I hope you feel able to try this out with your team now. It could be a bit unfamiliar to you to facilitate these kinds of activities with an online whiteboard and organising a coding exercise, but hopefully it's not too scary. I encourage you to give it a try. It could be exactly what you and your team need so you can do more test-driven development in your production code. Happy coding!